Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Dragons and the Snakes: How the Rest Learned to Fight the West, by David Kilcullen. Narrated by Christopher Douyard. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Introduction. It was mid-2012, as I was wrapping up Out of the Mountains, the book on future urban conflict that I finished later that year, when I began seriously researching the issues that underpin this book: the return of great power military confrontation, the convergence of state and non-state adversaries on remarkably similar operating methods, despite their radically different points of origin, and the notion that something in the environment created by Western military dominance since the Cold War might be driving that convergent evolution. Already clear was the growing influence and increasingly sophisticated methodology of competitive or actively hostile nation-states that were exploiting our exclusive focus on terrorism, seeking to fill the geopolitical, economic, and security vacuum we had left as we became bogged down in the wars of occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan. The signs were everywhere if one cared to look. The Chinese-constructed container terminal on Colombia's Pacific coast, as well as Chinese military advisors and hardware appearing across Africa and in Sri Lanka's fight against the Tamil Tigers. The Russian air cargo companies dominating licit and illicit transport operations in the Horn of Africa. Russian private military contractors appearing in Syria to support Bashar al-Assad's regime. Russia's decision to reopen its signals intelligence station at Lourdes, Cuba, directly targeting the United States. The Iranian and North Korean advisors and military operators in Venezuela. The competition for influence among Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, and their Gulf allies in the Horn of Africa and across North Africa. All of these were signs that, as we doubled down on the costly fight against terrorism, other risks and competitors were growing apace. To be sure, the signs were not as clear in 2012 as they are now. China's first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, had yet to be put to sea, and Beijing's island-building efforts across the collection of rocks, shoals, and atolls that it claims in the disputed South China Sea were just beginning, while the Chinese garrisons, radar jammers, anti-aircraft systems, and anti-ship missiles that now dot the area had still not yet been deployed. Russia had invaded and occupied Georgian territory, launched cyber attacks against Estonia, and promoted a frozen conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But the seizure of Crimea and Moscow's barely covert invasion of Ukraine were still in the future, as was the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17 by a Russian anti-aircraft missile, and Russia's return as a key player in the Middle East via its overt military intervention in Syria. Iran had yet to expand its footprint in Syria and Yemen. Its operations in Iraq remained clandestine, though dangerous, and its nuclear program, suspended in 2003, was the subject of ongoing, secret negotiations with the Obama administration in the lead-up to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian nuclear deal, which became public in 2015. North Korea's new leader, Kim Jong-un, had yet to show his ruthless mettle, being regarded by many observers as young, callow, and likely to remain under the thumb of powerful generals and older relatives, many of whom he later killed. While the Arab Spring was in full retreat by the mid-2012, the Benghazi attack had yet to hammer home the failure of the Libya intervention, and the rise of the Islamic State was still a niche concern for Iraq watchers who struggled to gain attention or traction from a U.S. administration that considered the Iraq War done and dusted the moment we withdrew, as if leaving the conflict equated to ending it. By early 2013, I was researching into writing, conceptualizing the new strategic environment through the lens of James Woolsey's testimony exactly 2 decades earlier, in 1993. In which he had talked of the West slaying a large dragon, the Soviet Union, only to find itself facing a bewildering variety of snakes in the post-Cold War environment. By the end of 2013, particularly after Moscow's diplomatic victory in resolving the crisis created by the Eastern Ghouta nerve agent attack in Syria, and Washington's failure to enforce its own red line over Assad's use of chemical weapons, it seemed clear that the dragon, in the form of Putin's Russia, was back. We were dealing with both state and non-state adversaries, at the same time, and in many of the same places. But it seemed equally clear that, in the intervening 20 years, the dragons, including China, had been watching and learning, figuring out how to fight like the snakes that had so bedeviled us since the Cold War, and particularly since 2003. While keeping a wary eye on Iraq, and as our field teams continued to support humanitarian and stability efforts in Syria and Afghanistan, my research team and I were increasingly focused on developments in Russian and Chinese asymmetric and unconventional warfare, which appeared as capable adjuncts to these countries' military modernization and expansive political and economic programs. But then, all of us were forced into a massive detour. The breakout of Islamic State across Iraq and Syria in the spring and summer of 2014 was not just a huge setback for the United States and Western countries seeking to stabilize Iraq, nor was it merely a massive embarrassment for a U.S. president who had described ISIS as a junior varsity team just months earlier and talked of the receding tide of war only days before ISIS tanks captured Iraq's second-largest city, Mosul, in June 2014. It also showed that, just as the dragons had been learning from the snakes over the past decade or more, non-state actors were copying state techniques and deploying levels of technology and lethality previously restricted to governments. My book Blood Year, published in 2016, chronicled the rise of ISIS, but it came out too early to track the group's eventual, albeit partial, demise in 2017-18. As its core pseudo-state caliphate in Iraq and Syria lost control of the territory and population it had seized in its initial wave of success, eventually to be extinguished as a territorial entity in March 2019. Its worldwide international network survived and continues to inspire and direct attacks, while a dozen ISIS-aligned groups, provinces, wilayat, remain active from Afghanistan to Nigeria, and from Libya to the Philippines. But even as I traveled across the region, spoke with numerous sources from Iraq, Syria, and North Africa, and finished Blood Year, I kept returning to the main ideas of the earlier book on convergent evolution, the way in which, unlike actors confronting a similar environment, can come to resemble each other. And to be sure, ISIS provides a striking example of one of these ideas: the increasing adoption by non-state actors of state-like tactics, techniques, and technologies. ISIS thought of itself as a state, levying taxes, establishing civilian governance structures, selling electricity and water, and trading oil on the international market. It fought like a state, adopting conventional tactics borrowed from nation-state adversaries, or derived from the large portion of its leaders trained in Soviet tactics under Saddam Hussein. It acquired tanks, artillery, and at least a couple of working aircraft, rockets, and mortars, and sought to seize and hold cities and control populations using remarkably conventional means. Its strategy, which amounted to seizing and holding territory, then expanding that territory through conventional military conquest supported by guerrillas, terrorist cells, and subversion efforts in its enemy's hinterland, was entirely state-like. The group's horrific atrocities and its mastery of social media tended to distract from its utterly state-like strategic approach. And though ISIS was eventually defeated as a territorial entity, in part because of its insistence on conventional warfare, and on continuing to hold cities and control populations rather than melting away, as a traditional non-state actor might have done, it came terrifyingly close to success. If ISIS represented one half of the equation, the other major developments of 2014-15, Russia's seizure of Crimea, its use of guerrillas and proxies in combination with conventional armored battle groups to invade Ukraine, the shooting down of MH17, and direct military intervention in Syria illustrated the other. For, clearly, Russian efforts were not solely conventional or state-like. On the contrary, just as ISIS borrowed techniques, organizations, and equipment from nation-states, Russia proved increasingly adept at drawing from the playbook of non-state actors. Sponsorship of militias and guerrilla groups, both in the physical world and via cyber militias and botnets online. The promotion of coups and separatist movements. The application of agitation and propaganda to destabilize adversaries. The manipulation of migration. The assassination of political opponents. The weaponization of energy supplies. And election interference all showed Russia's willingness to adopt the techniques of non-state actors while pursuing nation-state objectives. The election of Donald Trump in the United States, Britain's vote to leave the European Union, Catalonian separatism in Spain, an attempted coup in Montenegro, and ongoing attacks on Russia's neighbors in the Baltic and Caucasus regions, all showed signs of increasingly active Russian political and information warfare. At the same time, the unveiling of a series of advanced new weapon systems and a newfound swagger in international affairs showed that Russia was back to stay. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, South Asia, Latin America, and Africa, China's military, commercial, and industrial expansionism was demonstrating that other nation-states could play a similar game, drawing from a non-conventional playbook in order to achieve traditional, conventional goals. China's trade practices, industrial and economic espionage, political interference, and military modernization showed the country's aspirations to attain global great power status, its mercantilist ambitions, and its ability to fill the vacuum left by Western loss of credibility and tunnel vision on terrorism after 2001. Again, we saw a nation-state drawing on a combination of conventional and non-state means, as well as innovative approaches like the building of island fortresses in the South China Sea, and the use of commercial loans to acquire ports and naval bases in order to achieve its goals. And Iran and North Korea, both nation-states that had benefited from our distraction after 9/11 to advance nuclear programs supported by unconventional warfare, cyber warfare, and terrorism, were also applying creative combinations of conventional and non-conventional means. This book is the result of my efforts, both before the detour of 2014 and with renewed vigor since 2016, to make sense of what is happening in the global security environment as great power and nation-state competition returns. The dominant global position of Western powers, more or less a given after the end of the Cold War, erodes, and warfare assumes new forms that combine old tools and techniques in new ways. It is also the result, tentative and partial, of an attempt to combine knowledge from the fields of military innovation and geopolitical analysis with those of evolutionary science and anthropology to explain both how and why this is happening. Ultimately, it is also an effort to confront the ways in which our own behavior since 9/11 has brought the dragons back, and consider what we can do to deal with both dragons and snakes into the future. These efforts seem more relevant now than ever. If there is one takeaway from the chapters that follow, it is that the military model pioneered by U.S. forces in the 1991 Gulf War, the high-tech, high-precision, high-cost suite of networked systems that won the Gulf War so quickly and brought Western powers such unprecedented battlefield dominance in the quarter century since then, is no longer working. Our enemies have figured out how to render it irrelevant, have caught up or overtaken us in critical technologies, or have expanded their concept of war beyond the narrow boundaries within which our traditional approach can be brought to bear. They have adapted, and unless we adapt too, our decline is only a matter of time. Denver, Colorado, April 2019. Note on terminology. Throughout this book, I use the capitalized term Western, or the West, to describe a particular military methodology, along with a group of countries whose war-fighting style is characterized by that methodology. In essence, it is an approach to war that emphasizes battlefield dominance, achieved through high-tech precision engagement, networked communications, and pervasive intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. It is characterized by an obsessive drive to minimize casualties, a reluctance to think about the long-term consequences of war, a narrow focus on combat, and a lack of emphasis on war termination, the set of activities needed in order to translate battlefield success into enduring and favorable political outcomes. The West, as I use the term in this book, is thus both a military and a geopolitical concept. It means the loose collection of countries, most of which are allied or aligned with the United States, that fight using methods pioneered and perfected by the United States, and that often collaborate in coalitions or international institutions. This is not the same as European civilization. Countries that apply Western military means include non-European nations, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, for example. And this book is mainly about military, not cultural or political matters. Still, we should not forget that the modern world, for good or ill, was largely built by nation-states in that group, applying Western military methods. Indeed, the worlds we live in, with the growth of trade, the stamping out of slavery, the creation of global institutions for conflict prevention and dispute resolution, and the spread of free enterprise, human rights, and democracy, depends, to a far greater extent than some might wish or imagine, on 2 continuous centuries of British and then American global naval supremacy. Today's Western-led world order, then, relies to a great extent on the efficacy of Western military methods. And, if this book is right, that efficacy is fading. 1. The Dragon and the Snakes. Shortly before 10 a.m. on a windy, freezing Tuesday morning in February 1993, James Woolsey seated himself at the long oak witness table in room 216 of the Hart Senate Office Building on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. Woolsey was a Cold War insider, a Democrat by party affiliation, and a lawyer by training. He had been Undersecretary of the Navy in 1977 to 79 during the administration of President Jimmy Carter, represented the United States in nuclear disarmament talks with the Soviet Union, and served as general counsel to the Senate Armed Services Committee at the height of the Vietnam War. In 1989 to 91, in the closing months of the Cold War, he had served in Vienna as U.S. ambassador to the Negotiation on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which established limits on conventional, that is, non-nuclear weapons in Europe, and mandated the destruction of excess weaponry. Now he was appearing before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, seeking confirmation as newly inaugurated President Bill Clinton's Director of Central Intelligence, Chief of CIA, and at that time, head of the vast U.S. intelligence bureaucracy. As CIA Director, Woolsey would succeed Robert Gates, a future Secretary of Defense. But to take up his appointment, he would first have to convince the committee, including a future Secretary of State, Senator John Kerry, who had been extremely critical of U.S. covert operations and intelligence activities abroad, that he had what it took to lead the intelligence community into a new era. The Cold War had ended 14 months earlier, in December 1991, with the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. But the United States already found itself committed to a messy intervention in Somalia, experiencing mission creep toward the battle that would kill 18 Americans and thousands of Somalis within months of Woolsey's testimony, and to be immortalized in Mark Bowden's book, Black Hawk Down. In Europe, Washington and its NATO allies were facing the bloody breakup of Yugoslavia and dealing with an emerging power vacuum in post-Soviet space. In the Middle East, U.S. aircrews were operating no-fly zones around the clock over northern and southern Iraq, and U.S. troops were conducting a humanitarian operation in Iraqi Kurdistan while dealing with a huge range of threats in other regions. In the course of his long and ultimately successful confirmation hearing, Woolsey made a defining statement on the era to come. In many ways, he said, today's threats are harder to observe and understand than the one that was presented by the USSR. The proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles to carry them, ethnic and national hatreds that can metastasize across large portions of the globe, the international narcotics trade, terrorism, the dangers inherent in the West's dependence on Mideast oil, new economic and environmental challenges. These and a number of other important threats to our security and our interests present intelligence problems that are extraordinary in their complexity and difficulty. And these challenges, if unmet, can decidedly affect our daily lives for the worse. Our two surrounding oceans don't isolate us anymore. Yes, we have slain a large dragon, but we live now in a jungle filled with a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes. And in many ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of. All the challenges of the 1990s, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, the rise of transnational terrorism, narcotics trafficking, organized crime, environmental and energy risks, ethno-sectarian conflict, are stated or implied in Woolsey's list of snakes, a catalog of threats that came to define the first 2 decades of the post-Cold War world. Indeed, his prediction so accurately described the following 20 years that it's no exaggeration to say that we lived then in a Woolseyan security environment where threats emanated mostly from weak or failing states and from non-state actors, snakes, rather than from capable state adversaries, dragons. For 2 decades after Woolsey's testimony, great power confrontation and state-on-state conflict, issues that were front and center during the Cold War, retreated, while day-to-day military operations and the strategic attention of policymakers focused on a greatly expanding range of non-state or intra-state conflicts. The first decade of that Woolseyan era, from Woolsey's Senate testimony in February 1993 until the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq almost exactly 10 years later, in March 2003, was defined by chaos across a swath of post-Soviet space in Europe, the fracturing of nation-states in Africa and Asia, and a series of far-flung peacekeeping and humanitarian interventions. I came of age in that world as a young infantry officer in the Australian Army. My generation, those of us who enlisted or graduated from Western military academies just as the Cold War was ending, served throughout the 1990s in a series of chaotic, ambiguous operations in places such as Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia, Cyprus, Haiti, Kosovo, East Timor, and Sierra Leone. Skills necessitated by high-intensity war, urban combat, armored warfare, air-to-air combat, anti-submarine warfare, air defense, contested logistics, national mobilization or defense against weapons of mass destruction, atrophied in many major armed forces. Some countries ended Cold War-era conscription, while others stood down their border security forces or did away with elite mobile formations. High-tech weapons systems were canceled by bureaucrats or politicians looking for a peace dividend. For professional soldiers, training for state-on-state conflict was something we dutifully tried to squeeze in around our real day jobs, which increasingly consisted of peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, humanitarian reconstruction, counterterrorism, and military advisory missions. To be sure, these missions often involved high threat levels, even occasionally intense combat, as in Mogadishu, but they generally lacked clear enemies against whom traditional military power could be brought to bear. In 1993, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright famously asked General Colin Powell, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, "What's the point of having this superb military that you're always talking about if we can't use it?" In the same vein, a 1992 book on Australian defense strategy was titled Threats Without Enemies, while in Europe, the French theorists Louis Francard and Jean-Jacques Patry characterized military operations of that era as contre-guerre, counter-war, where the phenomenon of war itself, not a particular armed adversary, was the enemy, and the fundamental goal was to end the conflict, not to win it. In the second decade of the Woolseyan era, from March 2003 onward, as the ill-judged invasion of Iraq slid rapidly from a triumphal 3-week blitzkrieg to a messy reconstruction mission, then into a horrifically violent insurgency, The United States and allied countries focused their resources and attention almost entirely on combating terrorism. Those of us who had cut our teeth in the peacekeeping and stabilization operations of the 1990s made the sudden transition to large-scale counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and Iraq, and smaller-scale irregular or unconventional warfare missions in Somalia, the Philippines, and numerous other African and Asian countries as part of a global war on terrorism, GWAT. Our peers in the intelligence community likewise found themselves increasingly engaging in lethal combat operations, as CIA and other agencies became war-fighting organizations in their own right, allegedly, according to a series of published accounts by agency insiders, launching their own drone strikes, fielding shadowy armies of thousands of local fighters, led and trained by paramilitary operations officers, and leading counterterrorism pursuit teams, CTPTs, on raids that were increasingly hard to distinguish from straight-up military operations. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were much more lethal than anything we'd done in the 1990s, but the difference was one of degree, not kind. Like the missions of the 1990s, our post-9/11 campaigns dealt with a multiplicity of non-state threats and sought primarily to end conflicts and stabilize local environments so that we could leave rather than conquer and occupy. To extend Woolsey's analogy, from 1993, we focused on snakes rather than dragons. But from 2001, intensely so after 2003, we narrowed our gaze to just one snake, terrorism, and one subset of terrorism, Salafi jihadism, the variant of Islamic extremism exemplified by Osama bin Laden, as we sought to cut the head off the snake, to repurpose bin Laden's own phrase, by killing or capturing al-Qaeda leaders. A series of strategy documents in this period, foremost among them the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, read as if the sole organizing principle of national security and foreign policy would henceforth be countering terrorism. Terrorists are organized to penetrate open societies and to turn the power of modern technologies against us, the 2002 strategy argued, claiming that the gravest danger our nation faces lies at the crossroads of radicalism and technology. To defeat this threat, we must make use of every tool in our arsenal: military power, better homeland defenses, law enforcement, intelligence, and vigorous efforts to cut off terrorist financing. The war against terrorists of global reach is a global enterprise of uncertain duration. America will help nations that need our assistance in combating terror, and America will hold to account nations that are compromised by terror, including those who harbor terrorists, because the allies of terror are the enemies of civilization. The United States and countries cooperating with us must not allow the terrorists to develop new home bases. Together, we will seek to deny them sanctuary at every turn. One problem with this formulation was the idea of terrorism as a single, unified opponent, one that could stand in for a traditional state-based adversary and be considered to have an overarching intent and objectives. Nobody, of course, believed that Salafi terrorism was monolithic. The tendency of jihadist groups to splinter, turn on one another, and engage in bloody internecine conflict over the most hair-splittingly banal doctrinal differences was well understood. Likewise, other varieties of terrorists, Shia groups such as Hezbollah sponsored by Iran, narco-terrorists such as the FARC in Colombia, and European separatist groups such as the Irish Republican Army and the Basque ETA, had little in common with jihadism. But the need to apply military decision-making processes designed for the Dragon during the Cold War to post-9/11 snakes led by default to two-sided adversarial planning. As the national security strategy conceptualized the environment, there was something called terrorism and its allies on one side, with civilization and its allies on the other. This in turn led to the notion of terrorists being organized, structured, and motivated by long-term strategic goals that were equivalent, though diametrically opposed, to ours. This planning construct, always artificial, proved increasingly hard to sustain over time. Far from being organized and focused, the enemies we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan turned out to be fractured into a perplexing multiplicity of competing groups, rather than a single worldwide conspiratorial network guided by the invisible hand of Osama.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?